The ink on the divorce papers was still wet when Garrett Thorne poured himself 3 fingers of Macallan and laughed. Not the polite chuckle he saved for investor meetings or the forced grin he wore at charity galas, but a deep, genuine laugh that rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 42nd floor office. Outside Chicago sprawled beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered by sheer force of will, the lights of the financial district glittering against Lake Michigan's dark expanse. He raised his glass to his reflection in the window, toasting the man who'd finally cut loose the anchor dragging him down. Vivienne stood near the door clutching the same canvas tote bag she'd carried for 6 years. The cardigan she wore had cost $12 at a thrift store in Pilsen, and her jeans were practical in the way only truly cheap denim could be. To anyone glancing through the glass walls of Apex Capital's executive suite, she might have been a visiting social worker or a librarian who'd wandered into the wrong building. To Garrett, she looked like a mistake he'd made at 27, a lapse in judgment he was finally correcting. "The papers are on the credenza, Vivienne." Garrett didn't look up from his laptop screen where projections for the Series C funding round glowed in neat columns of green. "I've already signed. Just need your scribble, and you can go back to whatever it is you do all day. Clipping coupons, knitting socks." Vivienne walked to the credenza with movements that were slow and deliberate, each step measured. She didn't look angry, didn't look sad. She looked resigned, like a woman who'd known this moment was coming and had made her peace with it months ago. Her fingers traced the edge of the document, pausing at the settlement terms. $350,000, the studio apartment in Brooklyn she'd been living in since he'd asked her to move out, in the 2015 Honda Accord parked in the garage downstairs. Generous, according to the prenuptial agreement she'd signed 6 years ago without reading past the first page. "Hello, Garrett." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating in their lack of accusation. No anger, no tears, no dramatic pronouncements. Just 2 words that somehow made the marble and leather opulence of his office feel colder. Garrett stood adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned to dress for the life he wanted before he could afford it. "Let's not pretend this is a social call, Vivi. This is a transaction. A liquidation of a bad asset. You get the apartment and the car. I get my life back. It's more than fair considering you brought nothing into this marriage but student debt and a cat that sheds on everything." He walked to the minibar, the same minibar where he'd celebrated closing his Series A 3 years ago, where he'd kissed Sloane Wexler for the first time while Vivienne was visiting her grandmother in Connecticut. The scotch tasted like victory, smooth and expensive and earned. "I supported you while you built this firm, Garrett." Vivienne's voice was soft, not pleading, but stating a fact the way someone might mention the weather. She picked up the pen, a heavy Mont Blanc that Garrett kept on the credenza specifically for signing important documents. The weight of it seemed to surprise her. "I worked 2 jobs so you could take those unpaid internships at venture firms. I paid for your first interview suit at Brooks Brothers. I edited every pitch deck you sent to investors for 3 years. And you've been repaid." Garrett's veneer of cool detachment cracked just enough to let irritation seep through. He took a long sip of scotch, letting the burn settle before continuing. "I paid off your student loans. All $43,000 of them. I bought you that Honda. But let's be real, Vivienne. You don't fit here." He gestured vaguely at the opulent office, at the Eames chairs and the imported Italian marble desk that cost more than most people's annual salary then, at the city skyline beyond. "I'm merging with Donovan Capital next month. Do you know what that means? It means galas in New York. It means dinners with senators and tech founders who've actually changed the world. I can't have a wife who looks like she buys her wardrobe by the pound standing next to me when Fortune magazine wants a profile. It's bad for the brand." Vivienne looked down at the divorce decree, her eyes scanning the dense legal text without really reading it. Irreconcilable differences. The phrase was so bloodless, so clinical. It reduced 6 years of marriage to a checkbox on a form. "Is that what this is about, Sloane?" She didn't say the name with jealousy, didn't inject venom into the syllables. If anything, there was pity in her voice, the kind of sad understanding you might feel for someone making a choice they'd regret but couldn't see yet. Garrett smirked the scotch, making him honest in ways he'd never been when sober. Sloane understands this world. She's a VP of marketing. She speaks 3 languages. She went to Wharton. She looks the part, Vivi. You're invisible. You've always been invisible. He took another sip, enjoying the burn, enjoying the power of finally saying what he'd been thinking for 2 years. Sign it, Vivienne. Stop dragging this out. You're getting a settlement that most people would kill for. Take it, and find a nice, quiet life where you don't have to pretend you understand what a hostile takeover is or why our cap table matters. Vivienne uncapped the pen. For a moment she hesitated, not out of love but out of a final ethical pause, like someone standing at the edge of a cliff double-checking that they'd really chosen to jump. She looked at him, searching for any trace of the man she'd married 5 years ago. The man who'd been ambitious but kind, driven but decent, the man who'd told her over cheap Thai food that he wanted to build something that mattered and asked if she'd build it with him. She found only greed and vanity staring back. "You're right, Garrett. I don't fit in your world." Finally. He muttered it under his breath, already thinking about the press release his PR team would draft. Amicable separation. Both parties wish each other well. Garrett Thorne remains focused on Apex Capital's explosive growth trajectory. Vivienne signed her name in the careful cursive she'd been taught at the Connecticut boarding school Garrett had never asked about. Vivienne Ashford. The scratch of pen against paper seemed to echo in the silent office, a sound like a door closing or a chapter ending. She placed the pen down gently on top of the signed documents. "It's done." Garrett strode over and snatched the papers up, checking the signature as if he expected her to have tricked him somehow, to have signed a fake name or left a blank space. But no, there it was, Vivienne Ashford in neat flowing script. "Perfect. My lawyer will wire the settlement funds to your account within 48 hours. Try not to spend it all on cat food." He turned his back on her, returning to his position at the window, looking out at the city he felt he'd conquered through sheer determination and intelligence. The city that would soon know him as the visionary who'd merged 2 fintech giants and revolutionized mobile banking for the masses. "You can leave your key on the desk on your way out. And Vivienne." "Yes, don't come back. The security downstairs has been updated. You won't be on the list anymore." Vivienne placed her house key on the marble desk with a soft metallic clink that seemed louder than it should have been. She picked up her canvas tote bag, adjusting the strap on her shoulder. "Goodbye, Garrett. I hope the view is worth it." She turned and walked out. As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, Garrett raised his glass to his reflection in the window, to the man who'd finally upgraded from the wife who'd never understood that success required sacrifice, required shedding the past like a snake sheds skin, to freedom, and to leveling up. He had no idea that the settlement he was so proud of offering represented less than the interest Vivienne's family earned in a single hour. He had no idea that the quiet woman in the thrift store cardigan had been hiding in plain sight for 6 years, testing him, hoping he'd prove worthy of the truth. He had no idea that failure was about to cost him everything. Vivienne walked out of the Apex Capital building and into the pouring rain. She didn't open an umbrella, didn't hurry to the parking garage. She just stood on the curb and let the cold October water hit her face, washing away 6 years of pretending to be someone smaller than she was. The busy Chicago traffic rushed past, splashing dirty water onto her jeans, and she didn't move. Garrett had been right about one thing. She had been invisible. But he'd been catastrophically wrong about why. She hadn't been invisible because she was nothing. She'd been invisible because she'd chosen to hide. A black Cadillac Escalade pulled up to the curb, its polished exterior beading with rain. It wasn't a taxi or a ride share. The windows were heavily tinted, the kind of tinting that required special permits and suggested the occupants valued privacy above all else. In this part of the financial district, luxury vehicles were common, but an Escalade with diplomatic plates and a driver in a charcoal suit was rare enough to make passers-by stop and stare. The rear door opened. A man in his early 60s stepped out holding a large black umbrella. He wore a suit that cost more than Garrett's entire office furniture budget, perfectly tailored, the kind of garment that whispered wealth rather than shouted it. His posture was military straight, his expression grave but kind, the look of someone who'd seen everything and judged very little. "Mrs. Thorne." He paused, correcting himself immediately with the precision of someone trained never to make mistakes. "Miss Ashford, my apologies." Vivienne looked at him and offered a tired, genuine smile, the first real smile that had crossed her face in months. "Hello, Edmund. You're right on time." Edmund Price, head of private security and legal counsel for the Ashford Trust, held the umbrella over her, shielding her completely from the rain. His movements were practiced efficient, the result of decades serving one of America's most powerful families. The board has been notified of the signature. The trust protocols are unlocked. Your grandmother was anxious about this day. Grandmother was always anxious. Vivienne stepped into the plush leather interior of the Escalade, where warmth hit her instantly, along with the scent of jasmine and aged wood. The seats were heated, the climate control already adjusted to exactly 71 degrees, the temperature she preferred. There was a cashmere blanket folded on the seat beside her, and a bottle of San Pellegrino in the cup holder, opened with a glass of ice, waiting. Edmund closed her door with a soft click and slid into the front passenger seat. As the Escalade pulled away from the curb, gliding silently into traffic, he turned back to face her. "We've taken the liberty of retrieving your personal items from the Brooklyn residence. They're already being transported to the penthouse at the St. Regis. Is there anything else you require from your former life?" Vivienne looked out the tinted window. She could see the Apex Capitol building towering above the surrounding structures, Garrett's office on the 42nd floor, just a glowing rectangle among hundreds. A monument to one man's ego built on foundations he didn't even know someone else had poured. "No, Edmund. Nothing. Very good." Edmund pulled out a tablet, swiping through screens with practiced ease. "Regarding Mr. Thorne, the forensic audit you requested 6 months ago has been completed. The findings are comprehensive and damning." He handed her the tablet. Vivienne scrolled through page after page of evidence, falsified revenue reports, embezzled funds from employee retirement accounts, offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands designed to hide assets and evade taxes, fraudulent statements to the Securities and Exchange Commission. It was a masterclass in corporate fraud, the kind of systematic deception that sent people to federal prison for decades. He thinks the Donovan Capital merger will save him. Vivienne's voice was quiet, almost contemplative. He thinks he's a shark, Edmund, but he's just a minnow in a tank he doesn't understand. Edmund's reflection in the window showed the faintest hint of a smile. "Shall we initiate the protocols?" "Not yet." Vivienne closed her eyes, leaning back into the heated leather seat. When she opened them again, they were different. No longer the soft, passive eyes Garrett had grown accustomed to dismissing. These eyes were sharp, cold, brilliant. The eyes of a woman who'd been trained since childhood to manage a financial empire worth more than most countries' GDP. Let him have his victory lap. Let him feel the high of thinking he won. It will make the fall so much more educational. "As you wish, Miss Ashford. Where to the hangar? The jet is fueled and filed for Paris. The family is waiting for my arrival." The Escalade merged onto Lakeshore Drive, leaving downtown Chicago behind. Vivienne pulled a phone from her tote bag, but it wasn't the cracked iPhone she'd carried around Garrett for 6 years. This was a secure satellite device with no brand markings, the kind of phone used by people who had secrets worth protecting. She dialed a single number. It rang once. "It's done." The voice on the other end was crisp, British efficient. "Initiate the acquisition of Aurora Holdings. Transfer the Apex audit files to legal, and tell the board I'm coming home." She ended the call and looked out at Lake Michigan, its gray waters churning under the October storm. Somewhere in that building behind her, Garrett was probably pouring another scotch, probably texting Sloan about dinner reservations, probably feeling like the luckiest man in Chicago. He had 23 days before Vivienne turned 28. 23 days before the trust her grandmother had established activated, automatically transferring control of $2.8 trillion in assets to the granddaughter who'd spent 6 years pretending to be poor. 23 days before he discovered that the woman he'd discarded like an outdated phone was about to become one of the most powerful people in the world. But Vivienne wasn't thinking about the money. The money had always been there, would always be there, a fact of her existence as immutable as her DNA. She was thinking about her mother, Constance Jr., who'd been forced into a marriage with a man she didn't love and had ended her own life when the weight of it became unbearable. She was thinking about the promise she'd made to herself at 12 years old, standing at her mother's grave, that she would never let money choose her partner, that she would find real love or die trying. She'd tried. God, she'd tried. 6 years of cooking dinner in a studio apartment, of editing pitch decks at midnight while Garrett slept, of introducing him to angel investors through carefully orchestrated chance meetings at tech conferences. 6 years of being the woman behind the man, hoping he'd turn around and really see her not as an asset or a liability, but as a partner. He'd never turned around. The Escalade pulled into the private aviation terminal at O'Hare, driving directly onto the tarmac where a Gulfstream G650 waited, its engines already warming. The Ashford family crest was painted discreetly near the tail, visible only to those who knew what to look for. Edmund opened her door umbrella, already deployed against the rain. "Your grandmother left instructions. There's a letter in your cabin." Vivienne climbed the stairs into the jet where the interior smelled like leather and possibility. The cabin was appointed in cream and navy, with seats that converted to beds and a workspace equipped with secure communications equipment. On the desk, in a cream envelope sealed with burgundy wax, was a letter in her grandmother's spidery handwriting. She broke the seal and unfolded the heavy stationery. "Dearest Vivienne, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're free. Free from the burden I placed on you, the test I designed when you were too young to consent to it. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for so much. Your mother died because I forced her into a life she didn't choose. I thought I was protecting the family legacy. I was protecting nothing but my own fear of change. So I gave you a choice. I never gave her 7 years to find love without the weight of our name, or wait until 28 and the money would be yours regardless. You chose to try. That takes more courage than I ever had. If the man you chose proved worthy, you'll have built something real, and you won't need this letter. If he proved unworthy, as I suspect he has, then you've learned the hardest lesson, that some people will only ever love what you can give them, never who you are. Don't let that make you hard, darling girl. Don't let it make you cruel. The money is power, yes, but only if you use it to build rather than destroy. Your loving grandmother, Constance." Vivienne folded the letter carefully and placed it in her bag. Through the window she could see the lights of Chicago disappearing below as the jet climbed through the clouds. Somewhere down there, Garrett was celebrating his freedom. Somewhere down there, a man who thought he'd won had already lost everything. He just didn't know it yet. The flight attendant appeared with a glass of champagne, but Vivienne waved it away. "Just water, please. I need to stay sharp." She opened her laptop and pulled up the Apex Capital file. Page after page of Garrett's fraud, documented with the thoroughness that only unlimited resources and 6 months of investigation could provide. Edmund and his team had been meticulous. Every false invoice, every hidden account, every lie to investors was cataloged and cross-referenced. But buried in the financial documents was something else, something Garrett had no idea existed. Vivienne opened a separate folder labeled Intellectual Property and smiled for the second time that day. This smile was different from the tired one she'd given Edmund. This smile had teeth. 3 years ago, acting through a subsidiary corporation she controlled, Vivienne had filed a provisional patent for a financial technology algorithm. The filing had been done quietly through lawyers in Delaware who specialized in protecting tech innovations before they went to market. The algorithm was described in dense technical language that would mean nothing to most people but everything to anyone in fintech. It was the same algorithm that powered Apex Capital's entire platform, the algorithm that Garrett presented to investors as his own revolutionary innovation, the algorithm that Vivienne had coded over 6 months of sleepless nights, teaching herself advanced programming on top of the accounting work she was doing during the day. Garrett had presented her work as his own. He'd built a company valued at $800 million on intellectual property he'd stolen, probably without even realizing he was stealing it. He'd simply assumed that anything his wife did belonged to him by default. The patent had been granted 18 months ago. The Ashford Trust, through its subsidiary Aurora Holdings, owned the IP that Apex Capital had been licensing without knowing it. Every dollar Garrett made, every investor he brought in, every valuation increase was built on a foundation that legally belonged to Vivienne. She pulled up her email and began typing. Edmund Initiate Acquisition Protocols. I want controlling interest in Apex Capital through Nightingale Ventures. Offer $175 million for 51% equity. That's more than fair given their actual revenues versus their fraudulent projections. Schedule a private meeting with Garrett Thorne for Friday, 2 p.m. The Peninsula Presidential Suite. Tell him it's standard due diligence for large investments. Make him think he's won. And Edmund, bring the fraud files. All of them. It's time Mr. Thorne learned what it feels like to be invisible. V. She sent the email and closed the laptop. Outside, the clouds had broken, revealing stars scattered across the night sky like diamonds on black velvet. The jet's engines hummed steadily, carrying her toward Paris, toward the family she hadn't seen in person for 6 years, toward the life she'd been born into and had temporarily set aside in the foolish hope that love might matter more than money. Garrett had taught her a valuable lesson tonight. He'd taught her that some people were constitutionally incapable of seeing past surfaces, that some people would only ever value what glittered rather than what endured. He'd taught her that hiding her power hadn't revealed his character. It had simply allowed his worst traits to flourish unchecked. She wouldn't make that mistake again. The flight attendant returned with water in a crystal glass. We'll be landing in 8 hours, Miss Ashford. Can I prepare the cabin for sleep? Not yet. I have work to do. Vivienne pulled out a legal pad and began writing notes for Friday's meeting. She would let Garrett have his 2 weeks of triumph. She would let him celebrate with Sloan, let him plan the merger with Donovan Capital, let him imagine a future where he was the visionary founder who'd made it without help from anyone. And then she would show him the truth. Not because she hated him, though there was anger buried deep beneath her careful composure, but because justice demanded it. Because 6 years of invisible labor deserved recognition. Because the algorithm that made Apex possible had been written by her hands, coded with her mind, protected with her family's legal resources. Because Garrett Thorne needed to learn that underestimating people had consequences. The jet flew on through the night, carrying Vivienne Ashford toward her inheritance and away from the life she'd tried to build on a foundation of love. Behind her, in a 42nd floor office in Chicago, Garrett Thorne slept peacefully, dreaming of conquests he hadn't earned and victories that had already turned to ash. He had 23 days left before the reckoning began. 23 days before he learned that the greatest mistake of his life hadn't been marrying Vivienne Ashford. It had been underestimating her. 2 weeks after the divorce, Garrett Thorne felt invincible. The legal separation had been finalized with remarkable speed, his attorneys steamrolling through the process with the efficiency that expensive legal counsel could purchase. The settlement had cleared from his accounts without even making a dent in Apex Capital's cash reserves. Vivienne had disappeared completely, no forwarding address beyond the Brooklyn studio he'd already forgotten about, no emails, no texts, nothing. She'd simply vanished from his life as thoroughly as morning fog burned away by sunlight. He'd moved Sloan into the penthouse at the Ritz-Carlton 2 days after Vivienne signed. The decorator was already planning renovations, talking about Italian marble and custom lighting fixtures that would make the space feel less like a bachelor pad and more like the home of a power couple. Sloan had opinions about everything from the thread count of the sheets to the brand of coffee maker they'd keep on the counter, and Garrett found her certainty intoxicating after years of Vivienne's quiet accommodation. The merger with Donovan Capital was progressing exactly as planned. Due diligence was underway. The lawyers were drafting documents, and the media coverage had been universally positive. TechCrunch had run a profile calling him a rising star in fintech. Forbes had mentioned Apex in their roundup of companies poised to revolutionize mobile banking. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with congratulations from investors and competitors alike. But the real victory, the one that made everything else feel like a prelude, came in an email that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while he was reviewing quarterly projections. The sender was listed as Nightingale Ventures Capital Partners. The subject line read, Series C Investment Opportunity. Garrett opened it, scanning quickly. Nightingale Ventures was interested in leading Apex Capital's Series C round with an investment of $175 million. The email was professionally written, hitting all the right notes about Apex's growth trajectory and market position. They wanted to schedule a private meeting to discuss terms before making a formal offer. He forwarded the email to his CFO with a note, "This is what momentum looks like." Then he called Sloane. "Babe, we need to celebrate tonight. The Series C just landed in my inbox. $175 million from a fund I've never even heard of. They came to us." Sloane's voice came through the speaker, bright with excitement. "Nightingale Ventures? I'll do some research. Where do you want to go, per se? 8 o'clock. Wear that red dress." He ended the call and leaned back in his chair, surveying his kingdom through the floor-to-ceiling windows. 2 weeks ago, he'd been married to a woman who shopped at thrift stores and drove a Honda. Now he was dating a Wharton MBA who understood cap tables and liquidation preferences, and anonymous investors were throwing money at him without even requiring a formal pitch. The universe rewarded winners. It was a fundamental law of nature that Garrett had always believed in, but was only now experiencing in its full glory. That evening at Per Se, Sloane looked stunning in crimson silk that caught the light every time she moved. They sat at a corner table with views of Central Park, the autumn foliage creating a tapestry of gold and red that seemed designed specifically to complement the evening's success. "To us." Sloane lifted her champagne flute, the crystal catching reflections from the candles between them. "And to the Donovan deal. I heard the signing bonus alone is going to be 8 figures. Low 8 figures. But the real money is in the stock options. Once we go public, we're talking hundreds of millions." Garrett took a sip, savoring both the champagne and the moment. "We'll be royalty in this city, babe. I've already looked at summer homes in the Hamptons. And we need to get on the list for the Met Gala next year. I know someone on the committee. Consider it done." Garrett cut into his lobster, the meat perfect beneath his knife. "I'm meeting with the Nightingale people tomorrow. They want a private session before formalizing the offer. It's practically free money, Sloane. They're based in Singapore and Zurich, totally exclusive. My broker said they've been watching my career for years. Nightingale Ventures." Sloane frowned slightly, her marketing mind already working. "I haven't heard of them. That's unusual for a fund throwing around $175 million. That's because they're exclusive. Private equity at the highest level. They don't advertise, they don't chase deals. They find talent and back it quietly." Garrett wiped his mouth with the linen napkin, already imagining the press release. "My broker said their CEO rarely attends preliminary meetings, but she's making an exception for Apex. They think I'm a visionary. Most of these funds are run by old men in suits, but apparently Nightingale is different. Probably some European heiress who inherited daddy's money and wants to play venture capitalist." Garrett's phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "Caldwell here." The voice on the other end was deep, professionally neutral, with the kind of accent that suggested expensive private schools and international upbringing. "Mr. Thorne, this is regarding your meeting with Nightingale Ventures tomorrow at 2 p.m., the Peninsula Presidential Suite. Yes, I'm confirmed. Who is this?" "This is a courtesy call. The CEO will be attending personally, which is highly unusual. You should be prepared." Garrett felt a spike of excitement. "The CEO? That's fantastic. What's her name? I'll have my team run a brief." There was a pause on the other end, a silence that felt weighted somehow. "The CEO prefers to introduce herself. I will say this. Mr. Thorne, she knows everything about you. Your background, your company's financials, your business practices, everything. Just bring your best self." The line went dead before Garrett could respond. He set the phone down, slightly unsettled but mostly intrigued. Across from him, Sloane raised an eyebrow. "What was that Nightingale? They're sending the CEO tomorrow. She apparently knows all about me." Sloane's frown deepened. "That's a little weird, don't you think? Why would a CEO attend a preliminary meeting? Because this is a $175 million investment and I'm worth her time." Garrett pushed away the flicker of unease. These eccentric billionaires love their power plays. She probably wants to size me up in person. Who cares, as long as the check clears? The next morning, Garrett dressed carefully. He'd been told to bring financial records from 2018 to present, so he'd compiled everything into a leather portfolio that looked professional, but not desperate. He chose his navy Tom Ford suit, the one that photographed well, and made him look both successful and approachable. Against the mysterious caller's advice from last night, he wore his red Heiress tie, not the blue one from his wedding. He wasn't going to let some unknown investor dictate his wardrobe. The Peninsula Chicago was old money personified, all marble and crystal and staff, who moved like ghosts through spaces designed to make guests feel simultaneously welcomed and intimidated. Garrett had been here before for meetings and dinners, but never to the presidential suite. That was reserved for visiting dignitaries and people whose wealth required privacy. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than it should have. Garrett checked his reflection in the polished brass doors, adjusting his tie one last time. He looked good, more than good. He looked like exactly the kind of founder that smart money bet on. The suite doors were already open when he arrived. Inside the space was even more impressive than he'd imagined, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Michigan Avenue furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, and a conference table that could seat 12 but currently held only one occupant. Edmund Price stood by the window, his charcoal three-piece suit perfectly tailored, his posture suggesting either military background or decades of formal service. He was older, early 60s, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Thorne." Edmund's voice carried the same neutral professionalism as the phone call last night. "Please sit. I'm here to facilitate today's discussion. My name is Edmund Price." Garrett shook his hand, noting the strength in the older man's grip. "I'm here to see the CEO. Is she running late?" "The CEO is never late, Mr. Thorne. She's simply allowing me to handle some preliminaries." Edmund gestured to a chair. "I trust you brought the requested financial documents." Garrett set his portfolio on the table, suddenly feeling like he was in a job interview rather than an investment negotiation. "Everything from 2018 forward as requested, though I'm not sure why you need 3 years of records for a Series C investment." "Due diligence." Edmund opened his own leather folder, pulling out a tablet and several printed documents. "Nightingale Ventures manages $2.8 trillion across diversified holdings worldwide. We don't invest, Mr. Thorne. We acquire. And before we acquire anything, we know exactly what we're buying." The number hung in the air between them. $2.8 trillion. That was sovereign wealth fund territory, the kind of money that could buy small countries or reshape entire industries. "I wasn't aware Nightingale was that large. Most people aren't. We prefer discretion." Edmund slid a document across the polished table. "Before we discuss the investment, I need you to review these findings from our preliminary audit." "Audit. I didn't authorize any audit. You didn't need to. Public filings, whistleblower interviews, forensic analysis of your company's financial statements. All perfectly legal, Mr. Thorne. You might want to sit down." Garrett was already sitting, but he felt himself sinking lower into the chair as he opened the folder. The first page was a summary of findings, bullet points that read like an indictment. Falsified revenue reports showing $12 million in invoices from shell companies that didn't exist. Embezzled funds from employee retirement accounts totaling $1.8 million. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands used to hide assets and evade federal taxes. False statements to the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding company valuation and growth metrics. Each allegation was backed by documentation, bank transfers, email exchanges, signed forms that Garrett had forgotten about or assumed would never surface. The file was comprehensive, devastating, and undeniably accurate. His hands started shaking. "This is illegal. You can't just investigate someone without their knowledge." "Actually, we can." Edmund's voice remained perfectly calm. "Everything in that folder came from public records, court filings, or voluntary interviews with former employees who were concerned about the company's practices. You, however, are facing 12 to 18 years in federal prison for securities fraud alone. The SEC takes a very dim view of founders who lie to investors." Garrett's throat went dry. "What do you want?" Edmund leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. We want to offer you a choice. Nightingale Ventures will invest $175 million in Apex Capital and acquire 51% equity. We'll inject the capital needed to legitimize your financials and pay off the debts you've been hiding. The merger with Donovan Capital can proceed as planned. That doesn't sound like a choice. The alternative is that I send this file to the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission. By dinner time, federal agents will be at your office. By tomorrow morning, your face will be on CNBC with the word fraud underneath it. Your investors will sue, Donovan will walk away, and Sloan will be gone before they put the handcuffs on. So yes, Mr. Thorne, you have a choice. Sign our agreement or go to prison. The room felt like it was tilting. Garrett gripped the edge of the table, trying to find solid ground in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath him. If I sign, what happens to me, you'll remain CEO in title. The market trusts you, and we need that continuity. But you'll have no voting power, no spending authority over $5,000 without approval, and your compensation will be restructured to $1 per year. Your actual income will be tied entirely to stock performance, and since Nightingale will own the controlling interest, your dividends will go directly toward repaying the $175 million we're investing to save you from prison. Garrett stood up, his face flushing red. This is slavery. I'd be working for free. You'd be working to stay out of a federal penitentiary. Edmund's voice dropped to something quieter, more dangerous. And you'd be keeping your reputation. If you refuse, I walk out that door and make one phone call. By Monday, everyone will know that Garrett Thorne is a fraud. Every article praising your vision will be updated with corrections. Every investor who believed in you will sue for their money back. You'll lose everything, including your freedom. Garrett looked at the window at the door, calculating escape routes that didn't exist. He'd built this trap himself, one falsified invoice at a time, one lie to investors layered on another. Edmund hadn't set him up. Edmund had simply documented what was already there. Where do I sign? Edmund opened his portfolio and removed a bound document. Right here next to the line that says, "Accepted by." Garrett picked up the Mont Blanc pen Edmund offered, the same expensive brand he kept in his own office for signing important documents. His hand shook as he signed his name, each letter feeling like a nail in a coffin. One more thing, Mr. Thorne. Edmund collected the signed agreement with the care of someone handling a valuable artifact. The Chicago Tech Innovation Gala is this Saturday at the Art Institute. It's the official announcement of your merger with Donovan Capital. You'll be there naturally, looking cheerful and confident? Of course. Garrett's voice came out hollow. Sloan is already picking out a dress. Yes, bring Ms. Wexler. Edmund's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been amusement. I believe the CEO is looking forward to meeting her. And you, of course. She has thoughts about the company culture and the leadership team's composition. Before Garrett could ask what that meant, the bedroom door of the suite opened. I think Edmund has made the terms quite clear. The voice was familiar in a way that made Garrett's stomach drop before his brain could process why. He turned around slowly, dreading what he was about to see. Walking into the room was a woman in a white Dior suit tailored so perfectly it looked like it had been designed specifically for her body. She wore heels that clicked with absolute authority against the marble floor, each step measured and deliberate. Her hair, once pulled back in messy buns or hidden under baseball caps, now fell in a sleek dark curtain past her shoulders. On her neck sat a sapphire choker that looked heavy enough and expensive enough to be a museum piece, but it was her eyes that paralyzed him. The same eyes he'd seen every day for 6 years, eyes he'd dismissed as soft and easily ignored. They were different now. Hard, brilliant, focused. The eyes of someone who'd been playing chess while he'd been playing checkers. Hello, Garrett. Vivienne's voice carried none of the hesitance he remembered. This was command pure and absolute. Garrett's mouth fell open. He looked at Edmund, then back at the woman who couldn't possibly be his ex-wife but undeniably was. Vivienne, what are you doing here? How did you get in here? I own the room. Garrett, in fact, I own the hotel. And as of this morning, through Nightingale Ventures, I own your debt, your company, and functionally speaking, you. This is a joke. Garrett stood up his chair, scraping against the floor. You clip coupons. You drive a Civic. This is some kind of elaborate prank. Vivienne didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't show any reaction at all to his denial. Sit down, Garrett. The command was so absolute, so infused with authority that Garrett's knees buckled and he sat without consciously choosing to. She'd never spoken to him like that in 6 years of marriage. She'd never spoken to anyone like that in his presence. You wanted the big leagues. You wanted to play with real money and real power. Vivienne walked to the head of the conference table and stood there backlit by the windows overlooking Chicago. Welcome to them. My name is Vivienne Ashford. The Ashford Trust controls rare earth mining operations across 3 continents, maritime shipping lanes that handle 15% of global trade, and the intellectual property licensing infrastructure that your entire fintech platform runs on. We're worth $2.8 trillion, Garrett. With a T. The room spun. Garrett gripped the table's edge. Your maiden name? Ashford. I never asked about your family. No, you didn't. You never asked about my parents. Never wondered why I didn't have photos of them in our apartment. You assumed it was because of poverty. It was actually for security. Edmund placed a bottle of water in front of Garrett, who grabbed it and drank without tasting. So what? You were playing peasant cosplaying as a housewife while sitting on billions, trillions. Edmund's correction was soft but firm. With a T. The Ashford Trust's assets under management totaled $2.8 trillion. I wanted to know if a man could love me for me. Vivienne's voice carried something that might have been sadness, if it weren't wrapped in such cold fury. Not for the portfolio I bring to the table. I wanted to build a life with someone who valued partnership, who saw me as an equal. I thought you were that man, Garrett. For a while I really believed it. She walked around the table, her heels clicking against marble with each step. But then the firm started making money and you started changing. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a prop, an accessory that made you look good at investor dinners. And when the prop didn't shine bright enough for your new friends, you threw it away. Her hand came down on the folder containing his fraudulent financial records. And you did it while being financially incompetent. Embezzling from employee pensions. Hiding losses in offshore shells that any competent forensic accountant could find. You built a company on fraud, Garrett, and you thought you were too smart to get caught. I built Apex from the ground up. Garrett's ego flared despite the danger, despite everything. From nothing to an $800 million valuation. That was my work. You built a house of cards on a foundation of theft. Vivienne's voice rose just enough to make him flinch the first time he'd ever heard her raise her voice in anger. Embezzling to pay for the Ferrari lease, hiding losses to impress investors, cooking books to inflate valuation. The SEC would put you away for 20 years, and that's before we get to the intellectual property issues. Edmund slid another document across the table. This one was different, stamped with official seals and dense with legal language. Provisional patent filing granted 18 months ago. Algorithm for distributed financial transaction processing with quantum-resistant encryption. Garrett stared at the words, trying to make sense of them through the fog of shock. I don't understand. The algorithm that powers Apex Capital's entire platform. The code that makes your app revolutionary. The intellectual property that convinced investors you were a genius. Vivienne opened a laptop and turned the screen toward him. 47,000 lines of code. Look at the commit history. Look at the author. The screen showed a code repository, each line of programming tracked with timestamps and usernames. Every single commit, every update, every bug fix was attributed to one username, V.Miller. I wrote this. Vivienne's finger traced down the screen. Between midnight and 4 a.m. for 6 months straight while you slept. I taught myself advanced cryptography on top of the accounting work I was doing during the day. I built this algorithm, Garrett. You presented it to investors as your own revolutionary innovation. That's impossible. You don't know programming. I have a computer science minor from MIT. I transferred there for 2 years before going back to Stanford for my MBA. You never asked about my education, so I never told you. The floor dropped out from under him. Every presentation he'd given, every investor pitch where he'd explained the technical innovations that made Apex special, every article that praised his coding genius had been based on work his wife had done while he slept. Through Aurora Holdings, a subsidiary of the Ashford Trust, I filed for patent protection 3 years ago. Edmund's voice cut through Garrett's spiraling thoughts. You've been licensing intellectual property that legally belongs to Miss Ashford. Every dollar you made, every investor you brought in was built on a foundation that she owns. So, this is it. Garrett's voice came out broken. You're going to send me to prison. Revenge for the divorce. No. Vivienne closed the laptop with a soft click. That would be too easy, and it would destroy the company. Despite your mismanagement, the engineering team is talented and the user base is real. There's actual value here, Garrett. I don't destroy value, I acquire it. Edmund produced yet another document from his seemingly endless portfolio. This is the restructuring agreement. Aurora Holdings will acquire 51% of Apex Capital for $175 million. We'll inject the capital needed to legitimize your financials and pay off the hidden debts. The merger with Donovan Capital will proceed as planned. Garrett looked at the document, hope flickering in his chest despite everything. So I stay CEO. I keep my shares. You'll keep the title of CEO because the market trusts you. But you'll have no voting power, no spending authority above $5,000 without Edmund's counter-signature, and you'll work for me. Vivienne's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Your salary will be $1 per year. Your compensation will be entirely performance-based, tied to stock value. And since Aurora Holdings will own the controlling interest, your dividends will go directly toward repaying the $175 million you now owe the trust for saving your company from collapse. This is slavery. Garrett stood up his chair, clattering backward. I'm working for free. You're working to stay out of federal prison and keep your reputation. Vivienne's voice dropped to something quieter, something that scared him more than her anger. If you refuse, I walk out that door. Edmund sends the file to the FBI, and by dinner time, CNBC will be reporting that Garrett Thorne is a fraud. Sloan will leave you before the handcuffs are even on. The apartment will be seized, your bank accounts frozen, and you'll spend the next 15 years in a cell thinking about the choices that led you there. She leaned forward, her hands flat on the conference table. Or you sign this agreement, keep your office, keep your title, and work your way back to solvency over time. Maybe in 10 years, if you perform well, you'll actually own something again. The choice is yours, Garrett, but you have 60 seconds to make it. The room was silent except for the muted sounds of traffic 40 floors below. Garrett looked at the window, at the door, at Edmund's impassive face, at Vivienne's cold eyes. He was trapped in a cage he'd built himself, one lie at a time, one stolen piece of code at a time, one dismissive word to the woman who'd loved him. He picked up the pen. Where do I sign? Vivienne pointed to the bottom of the page. Right there, next to where it says, accepted by subordinate party. Garrett signed, his hand shaking so badly the signature was barely legible. One more thing. Vivienne took the papers, handing them to Edmund without looking. The Donovan Gala is this Saturday. It's the official announcement of the merger. You'll be there smiling and charming. I'll be there. Sloan already has a dress picked out. Something unreadable flickered across Vivienne's face. Yes, bring Sloan. I'm very much looking forward to meeting the woman who fits your world so much better than I did. A knot of dread formed in Garrett's stomach, cold and heavy. Vivienne, please don't make a scene at the gala. I never make scenes, Garrett. Vivienne collected her laptop and stood smoothing the white Dior suit with practiced elegance. I orchestrate outcomes. Saturday will be very enlightening for everyone involved. She walked to the door, Edmund trailing behind her like a well-trained shadow. At the threshold she paused and looked back. One piece of advice, since we're going to be working together. Next time someone offers you something that seems too good to be true, ask yourself why. $175 million from an unknown fund should have made you suspicious. But you were too busy celebrating your own genius to ask basic questions. She opened the door. Welcome to the big leagues, Garrett. I do hope you survive them. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Garrett alone in the presidential suite with the signed agreement and the ruins of everything he'd believed about himself. He sat in the silence for a long time, staring at the skyline he'd thought he'd conquered, understanding for the first time that he'd been playing a game whose rules he didn't understand against an opponent he'd never seen coming. Outside in the elevator, descending to the ground floor, Vivienne allowed herself one long, shaky breath. Edmund glanced at her with something that might have been concern. "Are you all right, Miss Ashford?" "I will be, once Saturday is over and he understands the full scope of what he lost." The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. Vivienne stepped out, transforming instantly back into the composed heiress, the woman who controlled billions and showed no weakness. "Prepare the files for the gala. I want every board member from Donovan Capital to see them. And Edmund, yes. Make sure Sloane Wexler's termination paperwork is ready. I want her gone by Sunday morning." The Escalade was waiting at the curb, the same vehicle that had picked Vivienne up in the rain 2 weeks ago. She climbed in and immediately pulled out her secure phone, dialing a number in Paris. "It's done." He signed everything. "Saturday we make it public." She ended the call and looked out at Chicago, passing by the tinted windows. Somewhere in that peninsula suite, Garrett was probably still sitting in shock, trying to understand how the woman he'd thrown away had become his owner in the span of 2 weeks. Vivienne had learned something in 6 years of hiding her power. The people who underestimated quiet competence, who confused silence with weakness, who thought wealth had to announce itself with designer labels and luxury cars, those people would always lose to someone patient enough to wait for the right moment. Saturday would be that moment. The Tech Innovation Gala would be Garrett's public coronation as a successful founder and Vivienne's equally public revelation as the power behind his throne. Let him have these last few days of thinking he still mattered. Let him celebrate with Sloane, plan their future, imagine himself important. The fall would be so much more educational when it came from a height. The Chicago Tech Innovation Gala transformed the Art Institute into a temple of ambition and achievement. The grand staircase leading to the main hall had been lined with ice sculptures shaped like circuit boards and binary code melting slowly under gallery lights that cost more per hour than most people earned in a week. The guest list read like a directory of American tech wealth founders who'd sold companies for billions, venture capitalists whose portfolios included half the apps on every phone, and the journalists who chronicled their rise with reverent prose. Garrett Thorne stood near a pillar carved with lions and geometric patterns, nursing his 3rd glass of champagne in 40 minutes. The alcohol wasn't helping. Nothing helped. He'd barely slept since Friday's meeting at the Peninsula, his mind replaying the moment Vivienne walked through that bedroom door in a white Dior suit, transformed into someone he'd never really known. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Edmund's impassive face presenting documents that cataloged 6 years of fraud with the thoroughness of an autopsy report. Sloane stood beside him in a canary yellow gown that had cost $8,000, the plunging neckline drawing looks from every direction. She'd been thrilled when he'd told her about the Nightingale investment, less thrilled when he'd explained the terms. The conversation had devolved into an argument about why he'd sign away control of his own company, why he'd accept a $1 salary, why he was acting like he'd lost when clearly he'd won. He hadn't told her about Vivienne, couldn't find the words to explain that his ex-wife owned the fund, owned him, owned everything. The revelation would come soon enough. "This is it, Garrett." Sloane's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, sharp with excitement. "Look, there's Robert Donovan talking to Senator Matthews. We need to go say hello. And I saw the TechCrunch editor by the bar earlier. Stop acting so nervous, you look like you're at a funeral instead of your own coronation." Garrett forced something approximating a smile. "Just give me a minute. I need to get my head right." "Get your head right. We're the stars of this event. The merger announcement is in 20 minutes. This is your moment, Garrett. Act like it." She turned away to scan the room for photographers, her yellow dress moving like a warning flag. Garrett watched her and felt nothing except a vague sense of impending disaster. 2 weeks ago he'd thought Sloane was the upgrade, the woman who understood ambition and success in ways Vivienne never could. Now she felt like evidence of how badly he'd misread everything. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Mr. Thorne, this is Edmund Price." The CEO will be arriving in approximately 7 minutes. I'm calling as a professional courtesy to suggest you prepare yourself." The line went dead. Garrett's hand tightened around his champagne flute hard enough that the crystal threatened to shatter. 7 minutes. 7 minutes until Vivienne made her entrance, and this entire evening transformed from celebration to execution. "Did you ever find out who the investor is?" Sloane turned back to him, oblivious to his distress. "The woman from Nightingale who's supposedly attending tonight, I found out." Garrett's voice came out hollow. "And you'll see soon enough." "What's that supposed to mean?" Before Garrett could answer, the hum of the ballroom changed. It wasn't a silence, but a shift in frequency, like an orchestra pausing before the crescendo. Heads turned toward the grand staircase where guests had been arriving in a steady stream for the past hour. The whispers started at the back of the room and rolled forward like a wave gathering strength. Robert Donovan, whose name graced the capital firm Garrett was merging with, broke away from his conversation with Senator Matthews and walked toward the staircase with a look of reverence that Garrett had never seen the hard-nosed investor wear. Donovan was a man who'd made his fortune through hostile takeovers and aggressive market plays. He didn't defer to anyone. "Who is that?" Sloane stood on her tiptoes, craning to see over the crowd. At the top of the grand staircase stood a woman in an Elie-Saab gown the color of fresh blood. The crimson silk draped off her shoulders in a way that suggested the dress had been designed specifically for her body, catching light with every movement. Around her neck, the sapphire choker blazed with blue fire under the gallery's lighting, each stone the size of a thumbnail. She descended the stairs alone, not needing an escort or announcement. Every step was measured, deliberate, the movement of someone who'd been trained from childhood to command attention without demanding it. "My God." Sloane's whisper carried genuine awe. "Is that—" "Yes." Garrett's throat felt like sandpaper. "That's her." Vivienne reached the bottom of the staircase where Robert Donovan waited, and the older man actually bowed slightly, taking her hand with the deference usually reserved for visiting royalty. "Miss Ashford, we are honored, truly honored. We didn't expect you to attend in person." Vivienne's voice carried across the ballroom with crystalline clarity, pitched perfectly to sound both intimate and public. "I felt it was important to oversee my new investments personally, Robert. And please, we've known each other since I was 14. Call me Vivienne." The room erupted in murmurs. Ashford. That name meant something to the people assembled here, the kind of old American money that predated tech wealth by generations. Maritime shipping empires and mining operations, and the sort of dynastic wealth that appeared in history books. Sloane's fingers dug into Garrett's arm hard enough to hurt. "That's Vivienne. You're Vivienne. The one who wore thrift store cardigans and watched reality TV. She owns Nightingale Ventures. She owns the debt. She owns 51% of Apex Capital." Garrett watched his ex-wife move through the ballroom like a queen touring her territory. "She owns me." Sloane's face went pale beneath her professionally applied makeup, her carefully constructed composure cracking. "She owns what? How is that possible?" Vivienne and Robert Donovan began walking in their direction, cutting through the crowd with purpose. Other guests stepped aside, automatically creating a path. Garrett recognized some of them, venture capitalists who'd turned down his early funding requests, competitors who'd dismissed Apex as too ambitious, journalists who'd written lukewarm coverage of his Series A. All of them were staring at Vivienne with expressions ranging from curiosity to calculation. "Stand up straight." Garrett's voice came out as a hiss. "Do not say anything stupid. Just smile and let me handle this." "Handle what?" "What's happening?" But there was no time to explain because Vivienne had stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Garrett could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral that he'd never smelled on her before. Edmund materialized at her side, positioned slightly behind her right shoulder, like a well-dressed guardian. "Hello, Garrett." Vivienne's greeting was pleasant, almost warm, which somehow made it worse. "You look well. Is that a new suit?" Garrett managed a nod, his throat too tight for words. Beside him, Sloane had gone rigid with the dawning realization that she was catastrophically out of her depth. "And you must be Sloane." Vivienne's eyes shifted to the other woman conducting a visual inventory that took in everything from the canary yellow dress to the nervous way Sloane gripped her champagne flute. The assessment lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but felt infinitely longer. "I'm the VP of Marketing for Apex Capital." Sloane tried to muster her usual confidence, straightening her spine. "And Garrett's fiancée." The word hung in the air like a challenge. They weren't technically engaged. Garrett had never proposed, but Sloane had been using the term for weeks now, as if repetition could make it true. Fiancé. Vivienne repeated the word with the careful attention of someone examining something under a microscope. "How lovely. It's bold to move on so quickly after a divorce. But then again, efficiency is valuable in business, isn't it? I helped Garrett build this merger." Sloane's defensive instinct kicked in, sensing mockery, even if she couldn't identify its source. "I understand the lifestyle he needs. The image required for success at this level. The image." Vivienne's smile was gentle, which made it terrifying. "Yes, I can see you've put a lot of thought into that. Tell me, Sloane, do you know the history of this venue, the Art Institute?" Sloane blinked, thrown by the question. "It's old. It's prestigious. It was founded in 1879 after the Great Chicago Fire destroyed the original building." Vivienne's voice carried the easy authority of someone who'd grown up around institutions like this. "The building we're standing in was completed in 1893 for the World's Columbian Exposition. The families who funded its construction understood something important, that true power doesn't announce itself with loud colors or loud voices. It endures quietly." She took a step closer to Sloane, her voice dropping to something that only the three of them could hear. "Garrett signed a contract with me yesterday. Under the new restructuring, executive partners, including him, are subject to a morals clause. It requires that their public associations reflect the dignity and heritage of the parent company, Aurora Holdings." Sloane frowned, confusion giving way to the first flickers of alarm. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your dress violates the company's dress code for executive functions. And your presence here as the woman who began an affair with a married CEO before his divorce was finalized is detrimental to the brand we're building. You can't talk to me like that." Sloane's voice raised slightly, drawing glances from nearby guests. "Garrett, tell her she can't." "He works for me, Sloane." Vivienne's interruption was surgical precise. "And if you want him to keep his position and the modest salary that buys those cocktails you're holding, you'll lower your voice immediately." Robert Donovan cleared his throat, stepping back into the conversation with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd diffused countless tense situations. "Perhaps we should move this discussion somewhere more private." "An excellent suggestion, Robert." Vivienne turned to the older investor with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I think Mr. Thorne and his guest are feeling unwell. The press conference can proceed without them. You and I can make the merger announcement together, and I'll introduce the new management structure at Apex." "The new management structure." Garrett found his voice, though it came out strained. "I'm still CEO. In title, yes. But I've been reviewing the organizational chart, and there are several redundancies we'll need to address. Edmund has prepared the necessary documentation." Edmund produced a leather portfolio from seemingly nowhere, opening it to reveal documents with legal letterhead and dense text. "The termination papers for Ms. Wexler have been prepared per your instructions, Miss Ashford. Security is standing by." "This is insane." Sloane pulled her arm away from Garrett's grip, her voice rising to a near shout. "I'm the VP of Marketing. You can't just fire me. Actually, I can, and I have." Vivienne accepted this portfolio from Edmund and removed a document holding it so Sloane could see her name clearly visible at the top. "As of 5 p.m. today, your position was eliminated due to redundancy. We've consolidated marketing under the Director of Brand Strategy, who actually has a degree in the field rather than an executive boyfriend. Your severance package is generous. 3 months' salary plus the standard benefits continuation." "Didn't you check your email?" Sloane's face went from pale to red, humiliation washing over her in visible waves. Around them, other guests had noticed the commotion. Phone cameras appeared pointed discreetly but unmistakably in their direction. Whatever was happening here would be documented, dissected, shared across social media within minutes. "Garrett, are you going to let her do this to me?" Sloane turned to him with desperation sharpening her features. "You said you were running this company. You said I said a lot of things that turned out not to be true." Garrett's voice came out flat, defeated. "The reality is that I signed control away to save myself from federal prison, and now I work for my ex-wife at $1 a year while trying to pay back the money she invested to legitimize the fraud I committed. So no, Sloane, I'm not going to stop her. I can't." The confession spilled out before he could stop it, the weight of the last 2 days crushing his ability to maintain the facade. Around them, the murmuring grew louder. Journalists were definitely recording now, their phones held high enough to capture both video and audio. "Edmund, please have security escort Ms. Wexler to the exit." 2 men in dark suits appeared as if they'd been waiting for the cue, positioned close enough to respond, but far enough away to seem innocuous until needed. They moved to flank Sloane, not touching her but making their purpose clear. "This is humiliating." Sloane's voice cracked, genuine distress breaking through her carefully constructed image. "You're humiliating me in front of everyone who matters in this industry. I'm sorry you feel that way." Vivienne's response carried no satisfaction, no cruelty, just the flat neutrality of someone conducting necessary business. "But your employment status was determined by your performance metrics and the company's restructuring needs, not personal feelings. The security team will help you collect your belongings from the office Monday morning. I wish you the best in your future endeavors. I'm not leaving with you, Garrett." Sloane pulled away from him completely, her eyes bright with tears that threatened her makeup. "You're not a CEO. You're a puppet. A broke, powerless puppet who let himself get completely played, and I'm not wasting another second on someone this stupid." She turned and walked toward the exit, the 2 security personnel trailing at a respectful distance. Her yellow dress moved through the crowd like a warning light fading into darkness. Other guests parted to let her pass, their expressions a mix of curiosity and schadenfreude. Someone would have video of this online before she even reached the parking garage. Garrett stood frozen, the reality of what had just happened slowly penetrating the fog of shock. He'd been publicly humiliated. His relationship with Sloane had imploded in front of Chicago's tech elite. And Vivienne had orchestrated it all with the calm precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. The murmuring around them had grown into actual conversation, speculation running through the assembled guests like electricity through a circuit board. Robert Donovan touched Vivienne's elbow gently, his voice pitched low but still audible to Garrett. "Perhaps we should proceed with the announcement. Give people something else to focus on besides the drama." "An excellent idea." Vivienne turned back to Garrett with an expression that might have been pity if it weren't wrapped in such cold professionalism. "You're dismissed, Garrett. Go home. Edmund will email you the employee handbook and your schedule for next week. Be at your desk Monday morning at 8 a.m. sharp. We have a lot of work to do if we're going to turn Apex into something sustainable. This is my merger, my company." Some last flicker of pride made Garrett try to stand his ground, though his voice lacked conviction. "I should be up there making the announcement. You haven't earned that privilege." Vivienne's voice dropped lower, meant only for him. "And more importantly, you don't own enough of the company to make demands. If you'd like to keep the title of CEO and avoid federal prosecution, I suggest you leave quietly and let Robert and me handle the public relations. Unless you'd prefer I explain to these journalists exactly why the merger terms changed and who's actually in control now." The threat was delivered with such perfect calm that it took Garrett a moment to register it as a threat at all. But the implication was clear. Go quietly, or be exposed publicly in even more devastating detail, and Vivienne held all the cards to make either option reality. He set his champagne flute on a passing waiter's tray and walked toward the exit without another word, moving through a crowd that had suddenly become hostile in its curiosity. He heard whispers as he passed, fragments of speculation that would solidify into stories by morning, his name attached to words like fraud and puppet and completely owned. By tomorrow, every tech journalist in the country would know that Garrett Thorne had lost his company to his ex-wife and been publicly neutered at his own celebration. The Uber he called was waiting outside when he emerged into the Chicago night, the autumn air cold enough to make him wish he'd grabbed his coat. The driver tried to make conversation but gave up after Garrett's monosyllabic responses. The ride back to the Ritz-Carlton penthouse took 20 minutes through traffic, and Garrett spent every second replaying the evening's disaster, each humiliation sharp and fresh as the last. The penthouse felt cavernous when he entered the decorator's recent changes, making it feel less like a home and more like a hotel suite designed for someone with money but no identity. Sloane's things were still scattered across the bedroom makeup on the bathroom counter. Shoes by the closet, a half-empty champagne bottle on the nightstand from this morning when they'd toasted the evening ahead. She wouldn't be back to collect them. She'd hire someone for that, or maybe she'd just abandon it all as evidence of a mistake she'd made betting on the wrong man. Garrett poured himself scotch from the minibar, the same Macallan he'd been drinking the night Vivienne signed the divorce papers. The symmetry felt intentional somehow, like the universe completing a circle. He stood at the window looking out at Lake Michigan, the same view that had seemed like proof of his success just weeks ago now, just a reminder of height from which he'd fallen. His phone buzzed with notifications, news alerts, text messages from investors asking what happened at the gala, emails from board members requesting emergency meetings. He ignored all of them and opened his laptop instead, pulling up the Apex Capital website. His photo was still there on the leadership page, still listed as founder and CEO. By Monday, that would probably change. His title would remain, but the reality underneath it would be completely rewritten. The scotch wasn't helping. He poured another anyway. At 11 p.m., his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number with a 312 area code, local but unfamiliar. Garrett almost didn't answer, but some masochistic impulse made him pick up. "Mr. Thorne, this is Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's Chicago Field Office White-Collar Crimes Division. I'm calling about your company, Apex Capital. We've received documentation regarding potential securities fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement from employee retirement accounts. We'd like to schedule a time for you to come to our office to discuss these allegations. Are you available Monday morning at 9 a.m.? The floor dropped out from beneath him. FBI. Securities fraud. Monday morning. Vivienne hadn't just taken his company and humiliated him publicly. She'd positioned him one step away from federal prison, hanging that threat over him like a blade that could drop at any moment if he failed to perform exactly as instructed. "I have an attorney. Any questions should go through legal counsel." His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Of course, that's your right. Have your attorney contact me at this number Monday morning before 9. But Mr. Thorne, I should tell you that the documentation we received is extremely detailed and well organized. Bank records, email exchanges, signed documents. Whoever compiled it knew exactly what they were doing. I'd strongly suggest you cooperate fully with our investigation if you want any chance of avoiding formal charges." The call ended. Garrett stood in the silent penthouse, the phone still pressed to his ear, understanding with crystalline clarity that he'd miscalculated everything. The divorce hadn't been the end of his marriage to Vivienne. It had been the opening move in a chess game where she controlled every piece and knew the endgame before he'd even realized they were playing. At midnight, exactly as promised, an email arrived from Edmund Price. The subject line read, "Employee Handbook, Organizational Chart, and Weekly Schedule." Garrett opened it with shaking hands. The organizational chart showed his title as CEO, but with dotted reporting lines to Vivienne's position as board chair and Edmund's as chief operating officer. His spending authority was listed at $5,000. His salary $1 annually with performance-based compensation tied to metrics that would take years to achieve even under optimal conditions. Below that was a calendar of mandatory meetings that filled every day. Monday morning staff alignment at 8 a.m. Tuesday board review at 7 a.m. Wednesday, financial audit session at 8:30 a.m. Thursday, strategic planning at 7:30 a.m. Friday, all-hands company meeting at 9 a.m. Every minute of his professional life scheduled and controlled with Edmund copied on every meeting invitation. The employee handbook was 200 pages of corporate policies, each one designed to limit his authority while maintaining his title for public consumption. He couldn't hire or fire without board approval, couldn't make media statements without PR team review, couldn't travel on company business without advance authorization from Edmund, couldn't access financial systems without two-factor authentication that required Edmund's approval, couldn't sign contracts above $5,000 without counter-signature. He was a figurehead, a face for the company, while the real power operated behind him, through him, around him. Garrett closed the laptop and returned to the window with his scotch. Below, Chicago glittered with lights that represented thousands of people living their lives, pursuing their ambitions, making their choices. He wondered how many of them had thrown away something irreplaceable because they'd been too arrogant to see its value. He wondered how many had looked at someone who loved them and decided they deserved better, only to discover years later that better was an illusion, and what they'd had was already everything. His phone buzzed again. Another email, this one from his attorney with the subject line, "Urgent FBI Contact." Garrett didn't open it. He knew what it would say. Meet with Agent Chen, cooperate fully. Hope that the fact that the financial irregularities had been corrected through Aurora Holdings' capital injection would be enough to avoid formal charges. Hope that Vivienne's influence and the fact that she now controlled the company would convince federal prosecutors that prosecution wasn't in anyone's interest. Hope, in other words, that his ex-wife would continue protecting him from the consequences of his own fraud. The realization settled over him like a weight. He wasn't just working for Vivienne. He was completely dependent on her mercy, on her continued willingness to keep him out of federal prison. If he failed to perform his duties adequately, if he caused problems or tried to resist her control, she could simply step aside and let the FBI investigation proceed. One phone call from Edmund to Agent Chen withdrawing Aurora Holdings' cooperation, and Garrett would be indicted within a week. He'd built a cage of his own, making one lie at a time, one falsified invoice at a time, one stolen piece of code at a time. And now he was locked inside it with Vivienne holding the only key. The scotch bottle was half empty. Garrett set it down and walked to the bedroom past Sloane's abandoned belongings and collapsed onto the bed without bothering to undress. Sleep wouldn't come, but lying in the dark felt better than standing at that window watching the city that no longer felt like his kingdom. His phone lit up with a new notification, a text message from an unknown number. "You wanted the big leagues, Garrett. Welcome to them. Monday, 8 a.m. Don't be late. V.A. Vivienne Ashford." Even her text messages carried authority, the casual use of initials instead of a name, suggesting someone who didn't need to introduce herself because everyone already knew who she was. Garrett stared at the message until the screen went dark, then continued staring at the ceiling where shadows moved with the passing of headlights from the street below. In 6 years of marriage, he'd never once asked Vivienne about her family, about her education, about the life she'd lived before meeting him. He'd simply assumed she was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman with no resources who was lucky he'd chosen her. That assumption had cost him everything. Not just the company or the money or the lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to. Those were replaceable, fungible, the kind of losses that successful people recovered from with enough time and determination. What he'd lost was something infinitely more valuable and completely irretrievable. He'd lost the only person who'd ever loved him for who he was, rather than what he could provide. The only person who'd seen him when he was nobody and believed he could become somebody. The only person who'd worked 2 jobs to pay for his interview suit and stayed up until 4 a.m., coding the algorithm that made his company possible, and asked for nothing in return except partnership and respect. And he'd thrown her away because her cardigan came from a thrift store and her Honda didn't photograph well, and she didn't speak 3 languages or know which fork to use at expensive restaurants. The magnitude of his mistake was so enormous that it transcended regret and entered the realm of existential horror. He hadn't just made a bad choice. He'd revealed something fundamental about his own character, something ugly and shallow that he'd spent his entire adult life pretending didn't exist. Garrett Thornboy, genius founder, visionary CEO, had turned out to be exactly what Sloane had called him, a puppet. Not because Vivienne had pulled his strings, but because he'd never been substantial enough to stand on his own. Every success he'd celebrated had been built on foundations someone else had poured. Every innovation he'd claimed had been coded by someone else's hands. Every investor he'd impressed had been introduced by someone else's connections. Without Vivienne, he'd never been anything at all. The truth of it settled into his bones like radiation poisoning everything. Sleep finally came around 3 a.m., fitful and haunted by dreams where he signed papers over and over again, each signature binding him tighter until he couldn't move at all. Monday morning arrived with the inevitability of a bill coming due. Garrett, dressed in his most conservative suit navy, with a white shirt and subdued tie, the uniform of someone trying to look trustworthy and competent. He arrived at Apex Capital at 7:45, early enough to prove he took the 8 a.m. meeting seriously, but not so early as to seem desperate. The office felt different. The receptionist greeted him professionally, but without the warm familiarity she'd shown before the gala. Word had spread. Everyone knew that Garrett Thorne had been publicly humiliated by his ex-wife, that Sloan had dumped him in front of Chicago's tech elite, that he no longer controlled the company bearing his name. The elevator ride to the 38th floor felt longer than usual. His office was there now, relocated from the executive suite on 42. The space was smaller, but still respectable, with a view of the building next door rather than the lake. His belongings had been moved over the weekend, laptop desk photos, the awards he'd won, that now felt like participation trophies given to children. Edmund was waiting outside his door, tablet in hand, expression professionally neutral. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne. Your 8 a.m. meeting is in conference room C. I've prepared the agenda and distributed materials to the attendees. Please review the presentation before you enter. You'll be discussing Q4 projections with the finance team, and they'll expect you to be familiar with the numbers." He handed Garrett a printed packet. The presentation was comprehensive and professionally prepared, exactly the kind of work Garrett used to claim credit for, while someone else did the actual labor. "Thank you." The words felt strange in his mouth. He'd never thanked Edmund before, never acknowledged the work that happened behind the scenes to make him look competent. One more thing. Edmund pulled out a second document. "Agent Chen from the FBI has agreed to postpone your interview until Wednesday at 10 a.m. Your attorney has been notified and will meet you there. Miss Ashford has provided a letter to the FBI confirming Aurora Holdings' cooperation in correcting Apex's financial irregularities. It should help with the investigation. She's protecting me." The realization came out as a statement rather than a question. Miss Ashford is protecting her investment. Edmund's correction was gentle but firm. "You're a component of that investment, Mr. Thorne, a valuable one if you perform your duties adequately. I suggest you keep that in mind going forward." He walked away, leaving Garrett standing outside his diminished office with the presentation packet and the knowledge that even his freedom was borrowed, contingent on continued good behavior and Vivienne's willingness to shield him from consequences he'd earned. The 8 a.m. meeting went exactly as Edmund had predicted. The finance team presented numbers, asked questions, looked to Garrett for leadership he no longer possessed. He nodded at appropriate moments, asked questions that Edmund had pre-written in the margins of the presentation, and generally played the role of engaged CEO while contributing nothing of substance. Tuesday's board review was worse. Vivienne attended via video conference from New York, her face filling the screen at the head of the conference table, while Garrett sat in the middle, surrounded by directors who clearly took their cues from her rather than him. Decisions were made efficiently, initiatives approved or rejected with minimal discussion, and Garrett's input was politely acknowledged before being completely ignored. Wednesday's meeting with Agent Chen lasted 2 hours. His attorney did most of the talking, presenting documentation that Aurora Holdings had injected capital to cover the financial irregularities, that new controls had been implemented to prevent future fraud, that Garrett was cooperating fully with the company's restructuring. Agent Chen listened carefully, took notes, and ultimately agreed that formal charges weren't warranted given the circumstances. But she made one thing clear before Garrett left: the FBI would be monitoring Apex Capital's financial reporting closely for the next 3 years. Any hint of additional fraud, any suggestion that the irregularities hadn't been fully corrected, and the investigation would be reopened immediately. "You're very lucky, Mr. Thorne." Agent Chen walked him to the elevator, her expression hard to read. "Most people who commit securities fraud at this scale go to prison. The only reason you're walking out of here is because someone with significant resources decided you were worth saving. I suggest you don't waste that gift." The elevator doors closed on her stern face. Garrett's attorney patted his shoulder with false heartiness. "Well, that went better than expected. Just keep your nose clean and follow whatever protocols Aurora has put in place. You'll be fine." But Garrett knew he wouldn't be fine. Fine was something that happened to people who had autonomy and dignity and control over their own lives. What he had was a suspended sentence, a temporary reprieve that could be revoked the moment he stopped being useful to Vivienne's larger plans. The weeks that followed blurred into a monotonous routine of mandatory meetings and supervised work. Garrett attended every session, read every memo, signed every document put in front of him. He smiled for photographs at company events and gave carefully scripted statements to journalists asking about the merger with Donovan Capital. The press coverage of the gala had been brutal but mercifully brief. A few tech blogs had run stories about the drama, speculating about the relationship between Garrett and Vivienne and the real power dynamics at Apex. But mostly the narrative had solidified around the merger itself. The joining of Donovan's capital with Apex's technology facilitated by the mysterious Ashford family's Nightingale Ventures. Garrett's public humiliation became a footnote, a brief moment of gossip that got overwhelmed by the larger business story. Within a month, most people had forgotten the details of what happened that night, remembering only that the Apex CEO had some kind of messy personal situation that got resolved privately. But Garrett remembered every second. The look on Sloane's face when she realized he was powerless, the whispers of the crowd as he walked out alone, the feel of signing his name to documents that transferred his life's work to someone else's control. He'd thought success meant accumulation, gathering wealth and status and recognition until you had enough to feel safe. Now he understood that success meant something entirely different. It meant building something sustainable, treating people with dignity, valuing substance over appearance. It meant being the kind of person who deserved success rather than someone who just wanted the appearance of it. 6 weeks after the gala, on a Tuesday in late November, Edmund appeared at Garrett's office door with his usual impeccable timing. "Miss Ashford would like to see you in her office." It wasn't a request. Garrett saved his work, straightened his tie, and followed Edmund to the elevator. They rode in silence to the 42nd floor, where Vivienne's office commanded a corner of the building with views in 2 directions. She was on the phone when they arrived, speaking rapid French about something involving maritime shipping rates and port congestion. She gestured for Garrett to sit without interrupting her call. Edmund positioned himself near the door, a silent observer. Garrett waited, studying Vivienne in a way he'd never allowed himself during their marriage. She'd always been beautiful, but he'd never really looked at her. Never paid attention to the way she moved or spoke or carried herself. He'd been too busy looking past her toward what he thought he deserved. The call ended. Vivienne set her phone down and met his eyes with an expression that gave away nothing. "How are you adjusting to the new structure?" "Fine." Garrett kept his voice neutral, professional. "The team is performing well. User growth is up 17% quarter over quarter, and customer retention has improved by 12 points since we implemented the new onboarding flow. I've seen the metrics. You're doing adequate work, which is what I pay you to do." She opened a folder on her desk, scanning contents he couldn't see. "I wanted to discuss your long-term prospects at Apex. The board has been reviewing your performance over the past 6 weeks. Edmund reports that you've been punctual, prepared, and cooperative. You haven't attempted to circumvent the new controls or make unauthorized decisions. That's good. I assume it's the minimum requirement, Garrett. But it's better than I expected, honestly. I thought your ego might make you fight the new structure. The fact that you've accepted it suggests you're capable of learning from mistakes, which is encouraging." She closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. "I'm going to make you an offer. If you continue performing adequately for the next 3 years, if you follow the protocols we've established and contribute meaningfully to Apex's growth, I'll restructure your compensation. You'll still report to the board, but your salary will increase to market rate for a CEO of a company this size. Your equity will vest on a normal schedule. You'll have more autonomy in day-to-day operations, though major decisions will still require board approval. And if I don't perform adequately, then you'll remain at your current compensation level indefinitely, or we'll find someone else to fill the CEO role and you can take a position more suited to your actual capabilities. The choice is yours, Garrett. You can work your way back to something resembling what you had, or you can stagnate in mediocrity. But either way, you'll never have unchecked control of this company again. Those days are over. It was the most she'd said to him since the Peninsula meeting, and every word carried the weight of absolute authority. There was no negotiation to be had, no room for argument. Vivienne had made her decision and was simply informing him of the terms. I understand. Good. She pulled out her laptop, the dismissal clear. Edmund will schedule quarterly reviews to assess your progress. I suggest you use this time wisely, Garrett. Very few people get the chance to rebuild from mistakes this catastrophic. Don't waste it. Garrett stood and walked to the door but paused with his hand on the handle. Can I ask you something? Vivienne looked up, one eyebrow raised. You could have destroyed me completely. You had evidence to put me in prison for a decade. Why didn't you? For a long moment she didn't answer, just studied him with an expression he couldn't read. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, almost sad. Because destroying you wouldn't have taught you anything. This way you have to live with your choices every day. You have to see what you threw away and understand exactly what it cost you. Prison would have been easier, Garrett. This is harder, and harder is what you needed. She returned her attention to her laptop, the conversation clearly over. Close the door on your way out. Garrett left, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. Edmund was waiting by the elevator, ready to escort him back to his smaller office, his diminished existence, his carefully constructed prison. The elevator descended in silence. When it reached the 38th floor and the doors opened, Garrett didn't immediately step out. He stood there for a moment, letting the doors start to close before Edmund reached out to stop them. What she said about learning from mistakes. Do you think that's true? Do you think people can actually change? Edmund considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think people can change their behavior if the incentive is strong enough. Whether that changes who they fundamentally are is a different question. But Miss Ashford didn't give you this opportunity because she believes you'll transform into a better person. She gave it to you because you're useful to her and because letting you rot in prison wouldn't serve her interests. Whatever growth happens beyond that is up to you. The doors started closing again. This time Garrett stepped through them, returning to his office and the work that filled his days with meaning he hadn't earned but was desperately trying to deserve. That night alone in the Ritz-Carlton penthouse that no longer felt like home, Garrett pulled out his laptop and did something he'd been avoiding for weeks. He opened his personal email and began drafting a message. The cursor blinked on the empty screen for 20 minutes while he tried to find words that weren't inadequate. Finally, he began typing. Vivienne, I know you probably won't read this and I don't blame you, but I need to say it anyway for my own sake, if nothing else. I was wrong. Not just about the divorce or the company or Sloan. I was wrong about everything. I spent 6 years looking at you and seeing what I wanted to see rather than who you actually were. I saw someone small because it made me feel big. I saw someone without resources because it meant I was the provider. I saw someone invisible because I needed to feel seen. I didn't ask about your family because I didn't want to know. I didn't ask about your education because I was afraid it might be better than mine. I didn't ask about your life before me because I needed to believe there was no life before me, that I was the center of your story rather than just a chapter in it. You gave me 6 years to prove I could love you for who you were instead of what I thought you should be. I failed. Spectacularly. And now I understand that I didn't just lose a wife. I lost a partner who saw me at my worst and loved me anyway, who built my success while I took credit for it, who gave me everything and asked only to be seen in return. I see you now. It's too late and it doesn't matter, but I see you now. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that I finally understand what I lost. Garrett. He read it over 3 times, deleting and rewriting sentences, trying to find the right tone between apology and acknowledgement. Finally, he highlighted the entire message and hit delete. Some things didn't need to be said. Vivienne already knew everything he'd written. Sending it would only be another attempt to make himself feel better, to assuage guilt through confession rather than actually changing. And she'd been right about what he needed, not easy absolution, but hard accountability. Instead, he opened his calendar and looked at the next day's schedule. 8 a.m. staff meeting, 10 a.m. product review, 2 p.m. financial audit, 4 p.m. developer stand-up. Every hour accounted for every responsibility clearly defined. He could fulfill those responsibilities adequately and drift through the next 3 years collecting his dollar salary and hoping to earn back a fraction of what he'd lost. Or he could fulfill them exceptionally, not because Vivienne was watching, but because the work itself mattered. Apex Capital served real people who needed better access to financial services. The app had genuine value beyond Garrett's ego. The team he'd assembled was talented and deserving of leadership that prioritized their success over personal aggrandizement. For 6 years, Vivienne had done the invisible work that made his visible success possible. Maybe it was time for Garrett to learn how to do invisible work himself, to code at midnight like she had, to solve problems nobody would thank him for, to build something sustainable rather than something that merely looked impressive. It wouldn't change the past. It wouldn't earn forgiveness. But it might possibly 3 years from now, when Vivienne reviewed his performance for the final time, earn something more valuable, the knowledge that he'd finally learned the lesson she'd been trying to teach him all along. That true success wasn't measured in wealth or status or recognition. It was measured in whether you built something that endured, whether you treated people with dignity, whether you became the kind of person worthy of the opportunities you'd been given. Garrett closed his laptop and looked out at Lake Michigan one final time before bed. The view was the same as always, glittering lights reflected on dark water. But he saw it differently now. Not as proof of his conquest, but as a reminder of how small he actually was in the vast landscape of human ambition and achievement. Somewhere in that city, Vivienne was probably working late in her office, or attending a charity function, or speaking French on the phone about business he'd never understand. Living the life she'd been born to, the life she'd temporarily set aside to test whether love could matter more than money. He'd proven it couldn't, at least not his love. But maybe if he worked hard enough and learned fast enough and became someone worth trusting, maybe someday he could prove that growth was possible even after catastrophic failure. That people could change not just their behavior but their fundamental character if the incentive was strong enough and the lesson brutal enough. It was a thin hope, but it was all he had. And in the end, hope was where every real journey had to begin. Garrett got into bed and set his alarm for 6 a.m. Tomorrow was another day of supervised work and limited authority. Another day of living with consequences he'd earned. Another day of trying to become someone better than the man he'd been. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start.